Welcome, deer hunters, managers, and enthusiasts. This is Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. My name is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. Bronson and I are professors of wildlife management and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. Together, we've researched deer across the United States for more than 40 years. In our podcasts, we explain the why and how of deer management based on science. Whether it's research we've conducted or explaining research done elsewhere, we'll offer you a college course in the science of deer management.
But don't let Steve scare you. This isn't going to be a review of calculus or chemistry. Instead, we take results of research, reduce it to what's important, and explain how you can apply research to management. So join us for this episode of Deer University.
Welcome back to Deer University, folks, and this is Steve Damaris. And you know, you're used to hearing Bronson start these things off, and so I just thought I'd be different for a change.
Oh, you're different.
Yes, and I'm here with Bronson Strickland as always, and we have Marcus Lashley with us here today. And you know, Marcus is our habitat guy, disturbance guy. Burn it, and why after you burn it, shoot it. Something while you're in it.
That sounds like a great plan to me.
And you know, one of Marcus's overarching themes over the years has been looking at food and cover and how to create that optimum mix. And kind of the topic of today is food and cover, and we're going to talk a lot about it and talk about some of the research that the Deer Lab has conducted, and particularly Marcus leading. But it's been done at kind of a unique area, a unique property that's actually owned by Mississippi State University, the Andrews facility. And Bronson, you were instrumental in that property starting up as an entity. How did we go about getting that property?
Well, we are very lucky and privileged to have this. It was a donation, and it's less than 20 minutes from campus, which is really an asset for students and researchers to be able to have a property that close to campus. It's called the Andrews Forestry and Wildlife Outdoor Laboratory, and that name is really meaningful because that's precisely what we wanted it to be. We wanted it to be an outdoor laboratory / outdoor classroom. The motivation was that we wanted to use it not only a teaching tool but an outreach tool for adults, landowners, etc., so that they could come to a place and rather than having to see it in a magazine or see it in a video, they could literally see in front of their eyes what wildlife habitat management is all about. Yeah. So Steve, with that in mind, we set it up to characterize the current southeastern landscape.
In which pines are a critical part, and they're often managed.
Yes.
And so this was a large area of pine trees that had been planted in a plantation format.
Right.
And it was ready for thinning.
Yeah. It was, the stand is uniform except for one area that's kind of a wet area that wasn't in pines. But it's, let's just call it about 500 acres, planted at the exact same time. So it was almost one homogeneous pine stand. In fact, it was.
Yeah, very similar to many people's property.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. And so the idea was, let's manage part of it for the person. And, you know, this is something we always say. People get sick of hearing it. They get sick of hearing it depends, number one. And for me, anyway, they get tired of me saying none of these management strategies are wrong. It just depends on your objective.
Yeah.
And so you hear us wildlife people say, you ought to manage it like this. Well, you ought to manage it like this if your objective is wildlife species A, B, or C. So some people's objectives are to maximize income from timber. And so we wanted to manage part of the property that way. If this is your goal, then you are going to maximize revenue on the average from timber. But we wanted to highlight the contrast that you're going to have in wildlife habitat that is a necessary consequence of that. On the other end of the continuum, we wanted to show people that if you want to maximize wildlife habitat, it will come at the cost of timber revenue to some or to a large degree. And then we had something in the middle that we call our moderate, where we're kind of compromising. We're going to make some money off of timber, but not as much, but we're going to have a lot more wildlife habitat. Let me give you some specs on that for our forestry-minded people.
Yeah. So we end up with 3 treatments of timber thinning.
We had 3, timber thinning treatments. At the time of this thin, which would have been the final thin before harvest, so we were in the early 20s in terms of age of the trees. The basal area was about 120.
Which is pretty much complete canopy closure and then some.
At absolute canopy closure.
And there's basically pine needles on the ground and not much else.
Yeah, well, there's
shade-tolerant trees.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of shrubs in the mid-story, sweet gums.
Sweet gums and shade-tolerant trees in the mid-story that have come up and survived, but there's nothing on the ground for wildlife to eat.
So if a photon of light made it through the pine tree canopy, it was captured by a winged elm or a sweet gum halfway down.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we grew some fantastic pine needles.
And more importantly, they were all out of the reach of a deer to eat.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we had this uniform basal area of 120, and for one of the stands or a couple of the stands, we thinned it down to 80, which is kind of a typical. Someone may differ a little bit, but ballpark, that's pretty typical from a forestry perspective.
Yeah, they want to
maximize timber revenue.
Get a significant thinning removal, open up the canopy, but still with the idea we want to maximize timber production.
Yeah, you don't want to remove too many of your trees in that thinning because you're ultimately trying to maximize the volume of timber on the back end and the most.
Yeah, all of the nutrients and sunlight that you make available through the thin goes into new pine production.
Right. For the best class or the most valuable.
Yeah, the remaining trees that weren't thinned. But then if you're maximizing wildlife, you're going to try to get a lot more of that timber thinned out to make more nutrients available for wildlife-friendly plants.
So that's a great point. It made me think of a really interesting way to think about that. What you are trying to decide when you have these different objectives is what would you like to turn sunlight into? Do you want to turn sunlight into tree, or do you want to turn sunlight into deer? That's really what we're making a decision on.
Or bobwhites or turkeys or other ground nesting.
You can insert any species you want in there.
We're
really determining we have sunlight, that's the energy coming into the system from somewhere else. And plants convert it into energy in some cases for wildlife. We're really trying to figure out what would we like to turn sunlight into.
I've said it very similar in the past, a little bit different, but are you going to allocate sunlight? Your management, are you going to allocate sunlight to maximize pine growth, or are you going to allocate it for wildlife habitat and ultimately into bodies and tissue of deer, turkey, quail, etc.? So,
so we had the 80 basal area thin for timber maximization. On the other far end, where we're thinking more about those nutrients and resources of sunlight getting turned into animal targeted plants. What was the basal area there?
About 40 basal area.
So then you had an intermediate, it was about 60?
It was about 60, that's right.
Yeah, now, if you're a forester listening, you probably dropped your glass when we said 40. That's not what foresters want to do with the landscape.
Yeah, the classic line is when one of our Mississippi State foresters walked through the 40 basal area after the thin. I was standing right beside her. She looked up and said, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Yeah. Just committed this horrible sin by thinning it down to 40 basal area.
Yeah. If you were trying to maximize timber revenue, you probably did make a mistake.
But here's a caveat. We did make a lot more money off of that thin on that treatment. It's not going to make up for the final harvest, but
Sure.
we did make double the money on that thin per acre basis.
Sure.
So.
But the more valuable timber is on the end
Sure.
product. So
Yeah.
I see that.
Now that 40 basal area was an extreme end, but if we were talking to one of our friends like Wes Berger, who's all about producing habitat for bobwhite quail, he might have said take it to 30.
Oh, he just said cut it again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
what
exactly
are you doing?
right.
Why
So-
are there trees here?
Right.
So it's all relative back to your point about what do you want to allocate those resources to.
What's your objective?
Yeah. And so we weren't necessarily trying to maximize bobwhite quail. We were trying to maximize the wildlife option with that 40 basal area.
Sure. Well, and even, I mean, think of it this way: is that if you're driving down the road in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, et cetera, and you look to your left or right, and there's a forest there, a pine forest, you're not going to see what we produced on that 40 basal area.
It's a very rare.
It's a very rare sight,
Scenario.
and so many people do not understand that.
They don't even know it's an option. I mean,
Yeah.
they've never seen it before in many cases.
And so to go to a place like that and look out, and you still see that the canopy is still full of pine trees. But to be able to look through the stand for a couple hundred yards, and to be able to look up through the stand and see blue sky, and then when you look down at knee, well, you can't see ankle level through there. You have to look at knee level to waist level, and to see this really rich, developed understory with all of the plants and the browse and the grasses. I mean, and you start making a connection with people that is what wildlife lives on. At least most of the wildlife people we're working with.
Want to.
So
That's the foundation.
You basically, what you've just described is a situation where you're allowing the vast majority of sunlight to reach the ground level to that understory where all of the wildlife friendly plants are being produced for the most part.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we've got this great scenario of 3 basal areas of timber, and then we added these management, which a forester would refer to as timber stand improvement. It's a selective herbicide application to remove that mid-story.
And some of the stands, yep. So everything that's taller than your head, basically, all of those woody plants, the wing downs and the sweet gums.
That aren't pine trees.
Yep.
That aren't helping wildlife that we're interested in, and they're not helping the pine trees grow better. So we want to take that out.
So a few of the 60 and 40 basal area treatments also received that selective herbicide. What else?
Well, so within the 60 and 40 basal area, but especially the 60, so we then split that up into 3 different treatments, where we had a control where all we're going to do is control for basal area, no other treatment, and walk away. And Marcus et al. Would study the plants associated with that. Then an herbicide, followed by fire, and then fire only. So herbicide and fire, nothing, or a control.
Yeah, and if we wanted to make it a little more complicated, which I did want to, we actually, in the second time we implemented fire, so first of all, those fires across those stands were implemented in a May time range, if I remember correctly. It's pretty good timing in terms of the food production that you would get from that for a deer or the other species. But then I don't know if you remember or not, but then I also, on the second time we implemented fire, so I think we've done that twice, and now we're due for a third one. We're on a 2 to 3 year rotation there. We also broke those stands in half again, and now we have a May fire-ish, early summer, and then a late summer or fall treatment as well. So all of the fire blocks got split in half, and now have a different timing in each half that we keep switching back and forth, or intend to over time. So now we've whittled it down to pretty small management areas with quite a diversity in management strategies.
That's a whole another podcast episode there on your findings with that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, Steve, if I may.
Yes. Okay. Go ahead.
Why don't we move to the big topic at hand here? I'm going to kind of pitch it to Marcus here, and so tell us about this experiment you designed, where you kind of wanted to look at plant management and plant and animal relationships, and you used camera traps to kind of monitor this. Tell us about the design.
Trail cameras for most people.
Trail cams.
From a research standpoint, we'd call them a camera trap. So, the idea was, you've from your point of view, you were the one instrumental in starting this, but I saw the value in it immediately, not only from a teaching standpoint. I take my classes out there constantly. I was out there yesterday with the class.
Could I modify that and say you saw the genius? You saw the genius, the vision?
I wouldn't go that far, Bronson.
No. I would.
I know that you would. Yeah, so I just, what a great opportunity to not only study some important things about the wildlife that we care about, like deer and turkey, but also to pair that with the opportunity for students or landowners to come out and see it on the ground and actually be able to show this is how wildlife use this landscape. And particularly the landowners we work with are interested in deer or turkey or quail. Most of them deer.
That's right.
So, what I decided when I got here and saw what that you had created is not only try to make it a little more complex to make it a better study system for us to do that, but also saturate the landscape with trail cameras. So basically what I did with a couple of graduate students that have just now finished was go out, and every 5 acres on the property has a trail camera that is going to be there in perpetuity and has monitored that space for years now. So we ended up with about 81 cameras that have constantly been running for over 3 years now in those stands.
And one thing just occurred to me, when people are out there doing research or classes and all, you almost have to be careful about where you go to relieve yourself.
Oh yeah,
because you're going to be on camera.
I make that comment occasionally when we have people out there. It's like, look, you need to be careful. You are being watched right now. And the interesting thing is, the camera that we're using is black. The housing of it is, and all the trees are charred in a lot of the stands, so you can't even see the camera when you're walking around in there. So we had to, put little flags around or something to find where they are. But so we've basically saturated at a really fine scale. I mean, who puts cameras on every 5 acres that they have? It's just not something that
crazy
people do.
habitat people do.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was that's a relatively cheap way to get really intensive information about the whole community of wildlife and how they are using these different treatments, and more importantly, the conditions of the understory in any given location. So the poor graduate students, as part of their thesis, Don Chance and Johanna McCullum, got to not only go through umpteen thousands of pictures of all kinds of wildlife with all these cameras, but they also had to go to each of those locations and very intensively characterize the vegetation that was local to that camera site. So it sets up a pretty interesting study design to look at wildlife use. And so in other words, if you look at how deer use that landscape, you can go to individual points, know how many times you detect deer there, and then try to figure out what in the plant community is driving the deer to use it at that amount.
May we say genius again for...
if you're not going to say it for me, we're not going to say it for Marcus.
Okay.
No, you lost that privilege.
I wouldn't say it for me either, Bronson.
Okay.
That makes you feel better.
It does make me feel better. One thing, Marcus, that I have literally started incorporating when I'm out there working with people is we think about what we do job-wise as scientists, and we're all doing outreach to some point, and it is one thing, and you can convince a lot of people when we show them a graph of when you managed habitat or managed your timber stand this way, here was the result in pounds of food per acre, and you had this beautiful bar graph, and I think for people that are hardwired like us, why, that's enough. I get it. I get the picture.
Yeah.
It adds a whole nother component to it when then you can say, and the deer and or turkey and or fill in the blank recognized that, and they spend more time in that area.
That is exactly what I wanted to do with that. And the reason those students went to every one of those locations over and over again to characterize the vegetation and how it was changing on a camera by camera basis is that it was precisely that. What we really have commonly done in the past is we would radio tag animals. So put a GPS collar on a deer, and you may get 150,000 locations on that deer, and we can't go and characterize the vegetation in most cases at every one of those locations. So what we have commonly done in the past would be to get a more broad scale look at that habitat quality. So you may use GIS layer, just a landscape layer of vegetation type. In that case, all of Longview would actually be characterized very similarly because it's all loblolly. Or we may go further than that and say, okay, it's different kinds of loblolly pine.
Different basal area treatments or large-scale treatments.
So we've been refining that over the years, but until just recently, we haven't had that much data that was on a point by point, which I know y'all have done in the central Mississippi study with the GPS tags. We've actually gone back to actual locations of deer, which I think we'll talk about some today. But we did the same kind of thing with the cameras, where we have very good data on use of that space and have very good characterization of the plant community in that same space. We have not done those two things together and I'm talking about research on the topic as a whole. We have not done that many times.
Yeah.
So it's a really great way to go about it. It's very labor intensive, but using the cameras is a relatively cheap way to do that. And then, of course, the graduate students, they had to go out there constantly. And I know that was, the vegetation sampling was not fun. Maybe it was for Don, but he's kind of strange like that.
Yeah, Don's a plant guy.
Yeah, he just likes plants.
Categorically strange.
Yeah.
But just joking. Well, look, what'd you find? We've been talking this up, and so let me guess. Deer spent more time in closed canopy areas with no vegetation on the ground.
That would be categorically wrong. Yeah, that is not what happened.
So the deer behaved like we think they would behave. They made choices like we thought.
Sure. Basically, the more intensive the management, the higher the use. So the more sunlight we're turning into plants and the more we stimulate that with fire, the higher the use. So the herbicide and fire stands were very similar in their use by deer. And if you opened up the canopy and you were repeatedly disturbing it, you get high use.
And maybe we should point out here, Marcus, if things work like we hope they work, that we want to have a little video that accompanies this. Yeah. And we'll show that map where we can...
Absolutely, yeah. So what you would be looking at in that map is a heat map of use, so to speak. And basically what you will find if you look at that map is all of the stands, like we were talking about when we thinned it to a relatively low basal area, and they had fire entering the stands, and in some cases also herbicide. Those stands get really heavily used by deer.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of generalization we would normally make formerly when we didn't have very good or very high resolution habitat data.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we can go further than that now.
Well, in terms of going further as well, why don't we go into what seemingly was a counterintuitive result that you found that in hindsight and further inspection makes good sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to do, and I think we should discuss that because it may be a little bit confusing to the audience also. When we actually look at the vegetation characteristics around a camera that drive deer choice to use that area, so the things that they use the most, it was actually things that are most related to cover. So in other words, like high availability of grass. Now, I'm not talking about 3-inch tall wheat. I'm talking about native warm season grasses that are waist high or taller.
Shoulder high for some, yeah.
If we have a high density of that around the camera, it gets high use. If we have a high density of brambles, so blackberry thicket around the camera, it gets high use. One thing that was counterintuitive, and I think where you were going, and something that we should discuss that could be confusing, when we just look at the density of plants that we know deer love to eat, they actually don't use those areas very much. If we look at the highest density of those plants, we don't see high selection for it. It doesn't explain their use of that space. The cover metrics do really well.
Yeah, what we're talking about is relative use and importance of different variables. We don't want somebody to listen and think, oh, they're not choosing to eat high quality foods.
Yeah, that is not what we're saying at all.
That's not what we're saying.
Yeah, which is the reason we should discuss it and get into some of these details, because you said something, Bronson, and I think it was the last podcast, about how we have a food-driven system here. And we need to talk about that also. But what we're talking about right now is the animal selection of, at this really fine scale. And think about it from the deer's perspective. We have a really well-managed stand, and it's selecting to be in that stand and eat in that location because it has high-quality cover. That high-quality cover often is also high-quality food. But what we see when we look at these different variables in this way is the choice to be there is because it's safe to be there, and then they can eat there when that cover is also food, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like putting a Lazy Boy recliner by the refrigerator for Steve.
Yes.
It's the place he wants to be, right next to the refrigerator.
Well, he's going to sit in that chair wherever it's at, but he will sit in it more if it's right next to the refrigerator.
So if there were a recliner 50 yards away out in the yard versus the one inside by the refrigerator, you take the one by the fridge.
I'm not sure I agree with this concept. You're making it sound like I'm kind of lazy and want to sit around all the time.
Well, do you not like sitting in the recliner?
Actually, I don't even own a recliner, but
Wow.
if I did,
A comfortable chair.
It's that much of a crutch, he can't even own one.
What I like to do to relax is go out and cut some timber down and burn things and create deer habitat. That's the most relaxing way. And I'm saying that mostly in jest, because that's not necessarily what I do with my spare time. But so many of the habitat management techniques that we have talked about and we will talk about in the future are things that individual landowners can go out and do on their place on a weekend to relax. I mean, if you own some land and you just want to go out and do something out on it, and so you stump sprout stuff, take a chainsaw and cut some trees over.
Go blow out a small acreage that you can set on fire.
Yeah,
and then roast marshmallows on it.
So there are a lot of back to the relaxing and why deer choose to be in a spot. Making those spots for the deer can be a relaxing, rewarding activity for the landowner.
I like how you turned that on us.
Yeah,
You did a good job of spinning that around, Steve.
spin master.
Give you some points for that.
Oh, thank you.
That's pretty good.
That's good.
Thank you.
Okay, Marcus. So you said you had a. What did you say? You had something with me. You wanted to pick a fight, or you wanted to what?
That's not exactly what I said.
Yeah,
I said that we should discuss it because I don't want it to be confusing to people.
Okay.
But what I just said a minute ago, to recap, before we went on this little diatribe here, the animal at that scale is choosing to be in cover. And because we have it well managed, that cover happens to also have high quality food around in a high enough abundance that they can make that choice. But if you think about a deer's ultimate goal, how much is it going to eat if it's dead?
Not much at all.
Yeah, I can tell you how much. It's zero.
Yeah.
They will not eat anything if they are dead. So that has to take rank.
Living is priority number one.
Yes, you have to live first, and then you can decide to eat. You know, it's okay to miss a few meals.
Right.
It's only going to happen once that you die.
Yeah.
So, you know, that takes precedent in this case, and we've managed these stands really well, so the deer feel comfortable in that cover, and we have a relatively high availability of foods in there as well to select from while they're choosing cover. Mm-hmm. But if you look in the landscape, especially during hunting season, what choices are being made, that risk is really driving the choice, and they will choose cover during the day over food. If they have to trade, they choose the cover first.
Yeah, one or the other. But back to your comment about food driving the system at the larger scale, Bronson, is what you're talking about. That food is critical and a major limiting factor in much of the Southeast and really the eastern United States. It's about, you know, food is limiting deer populations.
Well, yeah, when you hear, you know, a lot of the people that are coming to us are, how can I increase antler size? You know, and body size goes along with that. And at a big macro scale, it's food. Yeah. Now, to your point, Marcus, individually, they have to live also to grow big antlers. They don't grow
big antlers if they're dead.
If they're dead, they can't do that.
Yeah. So, we're talking about an individual choice level versus a population level effect. And that's what I didn't want that to be confusing to people, because when you said it was food driven, you know, at that scale is absolutely correct. We commonly want to produce more food, but if we start thinking about this a little more as a hunter, what do we want to do, you know, relative to our neighboring landowners, for instance? You know, maybe we should tweak that a little bit. You want to provide high quality cover that has high quality food with it. And particularly during the hunting season, providing high quality cover that is waist high or lower, so that you can climb a pine tree and see the deer in the cover while they think they're in cover. That's when you really start impacting your hunting success.
So, Marcus, is this a good time to talk about the behavioral shift that was documented out there as well, speaking of that point of hunting?
Yeah. So, I mean, I know that you guys hear this all the time, and I hear it commonly. You know, I can't do any of this because my neighbors are going to mess it up. They shoot all my deer, all that. So I think this is where this kind of approach could be really valuable. So we think of the food limitation. We want to provide as much food. We put out food plots and in some cases feeders, trying to provide as much food as possible. But ultimately, when hunting season is in, the deer is going to make a choice to avoid risk first. And of course, an illegal hunting is going to occur during the day, so the risk is high then. They can wait till nighttime to eat. So what do? They don't eat, they choose cover. And they really choose cover when that cover also provides food. So what we saw on the Longview property, now this is a 500-acre property. It's also in a really poor shape. It's a elongated property, so it's not a big block even. So most of the deer are using multiple properties. Probably all of them are.
Yeah, they have to. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just not a big enough property for them to encapsulate their whole home range for the most part. So what did we see on this property? We have waist tall So, we have recurring fire in this system, a lot of sunlight getting down, so really developed understory of plants. You can see it in the video that we're going to put up. You can see a really high quality structure. A deer happens to be about that height, walks around in there, feels like it is in cover during the hunting season. And when we actually look at the activity pattern of deer leading up to the opening day of rifle season, we had about 50% of activity during the daylight hours when you could hunt them, 50% at night. As soon as the gun opener, and this happened 3 years in a row now, on the opening day of rifle season, we see a shift in their activity pattern. What do you think that shift looks like?
Oh, they went nocturnal.
That's what everybody always says. Mm-hmm. On that property, they went the opposite way.
They went diurnal.
Yes. So now all the neighboring landowners, who none of them have a 40 basal area, and none of them are burning at least with a 40 basal area like we are, or 60 for that matter, and none of them have the high quality cover that also provides high quality food that we have. And essentially, as soon as deer season came in, they had to make that trade-off. The deer has to avoid risk, and they do that by seeking cover during the day, which happens to be where we're at on that Longview property. And if you climb a pine tree and the cover is waist tall or lower, they are in cover, but you can still see them pretty well. So they're still exposed. But we went from 50-50 to 75% of the activity during the day and 25% at night.
Do you feel comfortable saying kind of when the peak was during the day?
Yeah. It's about 9 a.m.,
yeah,
9:30 in the morning.
Because you and I joked about, man, you could get up and go spend the first hour of sunlight on a duck hunt, take off your waders and go climb a tree.
Yeah. And the amazing thing about that was the magnitude of the peak. It wasn't just, a little blip in the behavior there. I mean, we had like 30% of the activity of deer was between 9 and 10:30. I mean, on a daily basis.
Pronounced.
Yeah, it's typically what you would see right at dusk. So we normally have this crepuscular, that's what we call that bimodal crepuscular activity pattern that we see in deer. That normally is what you see. I've seen that dozens of times from different places. I've never actually seen one that had this pronounced mid-morning peak like that. But I've never seen this situation either where I've monitored it, where you have this island of really high quality cover.
You've monitored it, and you have the cover and the food. And also, a factor to consider here is the surrounding properties probably have higher hunting pressure than the Andrews Research Facility.
They do. There's no question.
There is no hunting pressure.
Yeah. So the deer coming in, that activity peak spike at 9:30, 10 o'clock could be neighboring property. The hunters are getting off of their stands and spooking deer, and they're coming on to our relatively unhunted property.
They could be. But while there's not the hunting pressure on Longview, there are human pressure on it. There are people out there all the time. So, it gets a fair amount of pressure that way.
Yeah. Humans are on the property. Yeah.
And I think, Steve, to your point, I think that's a good point. I think the dimensions of the property itself are important to consider here. Is that, like Marcus said, it's a very thin, long, linear property. And literally on some of those places, I can look to my left and look to my right, and I can see the properties adjacent to us.
Yeah.
So it's not like this huge expanse area with no human activity.
Yeah.
They could be on one end of our property and smell someone on the adjacent property on the other side of our property.
Yeah, that's right.
But I do think that that's a very important point and probably contributes to what you found.
Yeah, sure. And so we want to be careful. We're not talking about specific recommendations. We are talking about specific habitat management techniques. But as far as we're not saying you need 500 acres for this kind of management approach. In fact, it's a much smaller scale. The attraction of deer to 5-acre blocks. Your camera sites are 5 acres each. We have evidence that deer are coming into a 5-acre block because of cover and food.
Sure.
As opposed to another 5-acre block. So, our listeners don't need to get, worried about, well, I don't have 500 acres to do this.
You're exactly right.
If you have 5 acres,
yes,
you could do this. And that's really the exciting part about this.
If you have a 5-acre property that's excellent cover, that's surrounded by other landowners that have poor cover, guess where those deer are going to hide? In your 5 acres. You're exactly right.
And I'm not a duck hunter, so I wouldn't go duck hunting first. I'd just get in my stand and wait for them to come in.
Yeah, well, to each their own.
You'd sleep in.
Okay, I could sleep in, yeah.
Yeah, just sleep in, have a nice cup of coffee, and go slip up in the stand.
Marcus, you alluded to this a minute ago, and this might be beating the dead horse, but I think it's worth emphasizing, is when you think about the years and years and probably decades, how do I get deer on my property? The knee-jerk response has always been food. We would say, some habitat management,
sure,
thinking of food, and we would have, and everybody, food plots to get deer on my property. Some people now are going to say supplemental feeding or baiting. That's where that obviously went. But what is so meaningful about this is cover.
Yeah.
Managing for cover may be a far greater magnet.
Right. And the way that you manage for cover often produces cover that is edible.
Right.
Yeah, and can we jump back? I don't know that we finished talking about the specific variables that you measured. We've mentioned the tall native grasses as being important. Did you actually mention the woody browse and the brambles as being other variables?
No, I don't think I did. That's a good point.
We don't want to people think, I got to start manage for grass.
Yeah. No, we're talking about plants that from about waist high down provide really good visual obstruction. So grass was one of those variables. Woody plant cover, so basically tree saplings or tree seedlings. That was another variable that deer are selected for. So if you're thinking about things that are head tall or taller, we aren't talking about those. We're talking about things that are waist tall and shorter. So tree seedlings that are in that stage, also brambles, which would be your vines and blackberry in particular was driving that relationship. All of those three things were very important to increase their choice to use that space. And 2 of those 3 would also produce some food. But our traditional things that we think of as high quality food, like forbs, they didn't select for forbs. If there was a high coverage of forbs, that didn't equal high visitation by deer. Same thing if we actually just cherry pick out all of the good plants, like just looked at greenbrier and blackberry and black gum and all the plants that we think of as high quality foods and make that a category, that also doesn't predict the deer use very well. So they didn't select areas because it had high quality foods in it. But the grass in particular, that's basically not edible. I mean, they can eat it, but they're not eating much grass.
No.
That one is primarily a cover variable, and it predicts their use really well. So if we start looking at it, the areas they use the most were when there's a high coverage of those variables that produce cover and food, and then next to that would be things that just produced cover, like grass, and then the things that were most linked to food we didn't see selection for. So the way that I would interpret that is they're choosing to be there because of cover, and they like there to be food also.
And Marcus, you mentioned earlier about telemetry projects that typically look at landscape and the deer selected for this general habitat type.
Right.
But you did mention a couple of our work studies that have looked more specifically. And actually it goes back way back to my South Texas days with our friend Bob Zaglin down at Peel and Sia Ranch. We did some of the early adult buck movement studies, and we looked at areas within home ranges that bucks were basically spending a lot of their time in, basically bedding areas, cover area. You know, where were they spending their time? And then we went into those heavily used areas within their home ranges and sampled vegetation, and then selected areas within their home range that they didn't use and sampled the vegetation there. And we actually found very similar results. The highly used areas within their home ranges, greater species richness of shrubs and brush back down there, and that brush species richness, the greater brush species, provided the structural cover and more food. So it was about cover and food during the hunting season.
Right.
And that property didn't have a lot of hunting pressure, but the deer were still choosing that because that's their natural tendency. And then our Central Mississippi project you mentioned, Colby Henderson looked at the same idea, heavily used areas within their home range and unused areas within their home range, and found the key variables, brambles, and screening cover during the hunting season. That's what deer are looking for. They want to feel secure first, and then hopefully eat while they're there. And if I could quote one more study that we did years ago in Oklahoma, where we looked at hunting pressure with Ken G at the Noble Foundation, and we had these stands. We had high hunting pressure, moderate hunting pressure, and no hunting pressure. And during the hunting season, after the opening weekend, bucks, these were adult bucks, they chose areas that had greater cover, and they used that cover. They didn't decrease their movement rate, they just moved within cover more tortuously.
Yeah.
And so they were feeding within that cover. So
pretty complicated. Let's revisit that word, tortuous.
Tortuous.
Want to define that? More complex.
More complex movements. If I'm more turning, I'm going to walk 100 yards. I could walk in a straight line. That's not a very tortuous path. If I walk 100 yards, but every 10 yards I turn 45 degrees and walk and then turn 45 degrees, that's more tortuous. And you could
zigzagged path is a tortuous path.
You can zigzag and stay within a 5-acre area and walk a mile, or you could walk a straight line and walk a mile. So kind of, back to the 5-acre camera sites, those deer were in there probably walking tortuously.
Sure.
Absolutely.
When they did walk.
They feel comfortable. And they do that more during the day during hunting season.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's exactly the same kind of thing that you saw on the tagged deer with the GPS colors.
Yeah. And the easy way to manage for food is to supplementally feed or put out a food plot, and a lot of people, that's their only way they can do it, and I'm not bad talking them per se, but that's not necessarily going to get deer out where you can see them during the daytime.
It's going to feed them good.
It's going to feed them whenever they happen to go there, but they're not necessarily going to go there during the daytime because they're in cover.
Yeah, and they can wait till night when it's safe.
Yeah, that's a good point, Steve. There's a lot of people listening that would love to do a lot of this stuff, but they lease land, and so they can't engage in some of this activity, but they're still enjoying listening to it.
That's right.
But yeah, a lot of us over our careers have fallen into that exact same category. We lease land, and the only thing we can do is plant some food plots. So we appreciate that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with it, but
Nothing
don't think
wrong
that's not necessarily the best way.
Yeah.
And if you can do more than that,
by all means,
this is a good reason to do it. We always talk about habitat management as a tool to improve nutrition and improve the deer herd health and those sorts of things. But what we're kind of getting into now is we can also use it to improve our hunting opportunity, to get away from that issue of, my neighbors are killing all of my deer. Well, if all of the deer use your property during the day and their property at night because they have a ton of food over there, but it's unsafe to use it, then that kind of solves that issue, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I think is an important thing that we should circle back around before I forget, we keep saying, or I keep saying, I don't know if you guys are saying it, but we're talking about cover that is about waist high and lower. If you let the cover get taller than that, then the cover becomes obstructive to you as hunter.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, if we have 10 foot tall, you could have excellent cover, but if it's 10 foot tall and you climb up a tree 20 or 30 feet, you still can't see the deer in it.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's too good of cover for you to benefit from it from a hunting perspective per se. So that's where coming back in with fire over and over. I had to bring it back to fire. So we are using the fire to augment the effects of increasing light and repeatedly take the level of vegetation back down below waist high.
Mm-hmm.
If you continually are doing that, the deer will continually use it for cover and food, and you can continually climb up a tree 20 feet and see them in it while they do it.
So Marcus, I know this is going to be an it depends answer at some level,
Mm-hmm.
but on the average, what rotation are you generally thinking of for it not getting much over waist high? Certainly not getting over shoulder high.
Well, at long view, that has been between a 2 and a 3 year rotation. When we get up to year 4, I think we have one stand right now that's at 4. That stuff's about head tall now.
Okay, it's out of reach, so to speak.
Now, from a habitat standpoint, it is still exceptional
mm-hmm.
cover, but you're not going to see a deer in it.
Yeah.
So we might want to go a little more frequent for the deer. So the same stand I'm talking about where we're 4 years old and it's gotten that tall, it's also a 40 basal area cut. So we're getting a lot of sunlight and it's fairly productive soil. So, things are moving pretty fast. So that's the high end. If you're in a southern coastal plain or something, you may have a little bit longer if it's a little poorer dirt or you're not getting as much rainfall or not as much sunlight's getting through. You may be able to get away with a little bit longer interval. But in terms of, in this context, a 2 year, you're still got some pretty high quality cover in that second year. And a third year, you can still see them in it. But by the time we got to the fourth, we're going to have trouble seeing a deer in it.
And planning within like a property, if you do own land, there's nothing wrong with having some 2-year-old, some 3-year-old, and some 4-year-old.
Absolutely.
On your property to have that range of.
And while we're at that, one of the reasons that I think that property is so attractive is not only do we have that variability within how much sunlight is getting to the ground, how frequently do we have fire, and then we took it a step further, if you remember,
timing. And
now we even have it broken up into multiple timings. Yeah. And those blocks, some of them are only 5-acre blocks, where we have a 10-acre stand, and half of it gets burned at one time of the year and half of it in the other, and we have a 5-acre burn.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that gets back to that whole genius thing again about the genius of this, like the bow range burning. I mean, you don't even need 5 acres.
Mm-mm. Think about it like a food plot, except this food plot can produce some really excellent cover where they'll eat in that food plot all day long.
You're talking about the genius thing he said, not what I said.
I think he was talking about you.
Oh, okay. Well, then right on. Yeah, exactly.
Right on, man.
The genius aspect of the MSU Deer Lab.
There we go.
The collective.
We all win that way. One clarification, Marcus, is we're talking about, because this work is done in a pine forest.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see any difference whatsoever if you were in a hardwood forest? So let's put the context a little bit different outside of pine management.
Sure.
Same thing?
I think the interval tends to be a little bit longer, and the fuels in that system are not quite as flammable. More importantly, in that system is making sure that you've thinned enough that you're getting enough sunlight to the ground, because you're much more limited on burning in an upland hardwood stand. Not necessarily because it won't burn, but if you're not getting enough sunlight in to dry out the fuels and produce some of that understory vegetation that carries the fire, you have a harder time burning. So you tend to need a little bit longer interval, but you also need a little heavier thinning to get the same amount of sunlight in.
Do you have a target basal area in that kind of hardwood system? You want to get below 60, below 50?
Yeah, I think about it in terms of how much canopy closure is there. And when I have seen it work really well, we were about half of the canopy removed.
Okay. Well,
can I
Steve,
jump in here? As you were talking about the hardwood thinning, it's a common conflict that I've seen with landowners that own hardwoods. Mm-hmm. They hate to harvest them. They just love the hardwood timber, and it's so beautiful, mm-hmm. and they want to just shimmy up a tree and have this nice view across their property of their hardwood timber. Right. That's not good deer management.
That is correct.
It might be aesthetically pleasing to sit in amongst all your hardwoods.
Right, and then during the hunting season, sometimes you'll have quite a bit of food available because acorns fall.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you brought that up. We just had a study recently that we had on the social media, I know, about a long-term experiment we did with white oaks. And we did this in Tennessee. And we basically looked at acorn production of individual trees to see how does thinning or releasing the tree. So in other words, if you cut down all the trees around a target white oak and leave that one there, how does the production of that white oak change? Or how does it change if you fertilize it? Or what if you thin around it and let the canopy expand and also fertilize it? And basically what we found is the only thing that matters to the acorn production of that tree is if you thin around it so that it has more space to grow. Mm-hmm. The fertilization, in other words, did not have any impact on it. And it also didn't change the deer selection of those acorns. They weren't sweeter or anything like that, like you normally hear. We did we did diet trials with them and looked at the nutritional quality of the acorn. But what I thought was particularly interesting is the production increased so much in that individual that you actually end up with just as much mass being produced, even though you don't have as many trees, because the ones that are left produce more acorns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were already the producers anyway, and now you just, I'm not going to say doubled, but you significantly increased the canopy.
Sure. Yeah, we have it on social media, and what actually happened mm-hmm. precisely, so you can look at the details there. But yeah, so that I hear that commonly too. People don't want to cut down trees, and they definitely don't want to cut down an oak tree. But that thing's worth a lot of money, and like you said, leaving all of them there is not necessarily your best strategy. Yeah. So we want to be able to get sunlight in the ground, but not necessarily lose our mass production, and that facilitates letting us enter the stand more often with fire. Mm-hmm. So if you combine all of those things, you could have really high mass production in excellent cover that you can also see deer in while you're hunting.
This could become tortuous. We cover all kinds of topics here. We could start talking about burning in hardwoods and all
sure.
that, but we kind of need to be wrapping up, don't we, Bronson?
Yeah, we're about at our target, our usual length there. So we're at about an hour here, so it's probably a good time to wrap up. I did have one more little tidbit for our bird hunting people. Mm-hmm. With turkey, you saw the exact same relationships. I'm not going to say the time of day behavior stuff, right. But where they were spending time.
Almost identical.
Yeah.
Now the variables rank a little bit differently, but essentially turkeys are deciding where to be based on cover.
Okay. So the same type of management that we're recommending here mm-hmm. is going to be just about synonymous for deer, turkey. One thing, this is a little bit of an aside, but a little story you told me, Marcus, and we were talking about the Andrews property, our outdoor laboratory there. You were doing a class out there, and you were probably about this time of year, maybe it was June. And we are fortunate enough that we have a few coveys of bobwhite out there, and that's really rare in the southeast.
I don't even know where they came from.
If you build it, they will come.
Yeah. A 500-acre property, 200 acres roughly, has been intensively managed. Not much else around there is friendly to a quail. So
there was a corridor somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know if they hitchhiked down the roadside or maybe down the power line. I'm not sure, but a lot of the landscape's not usable. So
yeah, these are not domesticated birds. These are wild.
These are wild coveys.
Wild birds that showed up.
I think there are 2 or 3 nice big coveys on there now.
But when they started whistling, you had students in your class that did not know what it was.
Oh yeah,
that have never heard of bobwhite. That is how much the landscape has changed in the past 20 years.
It's pretty interesting, and in that same context, not to be Debbie Downer or anything, but I asked the class, there's 15 students or so, how many of them had heard a wild quail. 0 of them had. So some of them knew what it was, but none of them had actually heard one in the wild before. And then I instinctively made the comment, you better listen because you might not again.
Yeah. What a shame.
Yeah. But what we're talking about produces the perfect situation for a quail to live, and it's a pretty small property, not surrounded by a whole bunch of great quail habitat. We've just said we don't even know how they got there, but apparently it was good enough that when they found it, they stayed there. And now when we started the camera survey stuff in 2015-ish, I remember there being 1 covey, and now I've found multiple coveys. So it seems to be a growing population. Now, are we ever going to have 10 coveys? No. But it's still nice to have a couple of coveys and 10 or 11 birds in each one.
Well, I take back to our message of outreach and teaching people. I think that's a great example of it's a lot different than looking at a picture in a magazine and talking about these concepts versus when they're out there and they hear a bobwhite and go, oh, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah,
you can see the light bulb go off.
Yeah, and that day we were standing in a stand, standing in a forest treatment. Not use stand for every word. The whole class, we were sitting there, and this was a wildlife plant identification class, and I talk about habitat management and go further than that and tell them about individual plant species and what they're good for and how they respond to management and all those sorts of things. But we were standing in one of the treatments that was 40 basal area and had been burned frequently, and it was just perfect quail, a perfect place for quail. And we were in the class looking at these different plants. Many of them are things that quail love, and the quail kept interrupting me over and over. Some of them were so loud that I would just have to stop and let it go on and sing its business. And it was interruption after interruption after interruption, and
it's a welcomed interruption.
Oh yeah,
that's right.
I was enjoying it. So basically, we just every minute I was having to stop again. From what I was telling them about the plants so that we could listen to the quail. And there were multiple bobs around us that we could hear. So
that is really cool. Well, gentlemen, why don't we wrap up here? This is going to kind of be a note for us too, Marcus, as we're and Steve, if you're with us, but we've thrown around basal area. I mean, if we're out in the field next week, we've thrown around basal area a lot. We said 40, 60. What are y'all laughing at?
I'm not that old.
He thought you were making an old joke.
That was not an old joke. We just have not talked. We talked about getting in the field next week and filming. So
Yeah, we need to make sure we do that so that people can see what we're talking about.
Yeah, let's make sure we characterize on a video the
Mm-hmm.
80, the 60, and the 40, and the canopy and all that. So,
Well, and one thing that people should keep in mind is that trees grow, and that was several years back when those were thin, so they're a little bit higher than that now.
yeah. Okay, gentlemen, I think we're pushing supper time here. I've enjoyed it. It's been a
Likewise.
while, so we'll do it again soon.
I'm going to go move my chair right next to the refrigerator and sit there.
Now, Steve's is already by the refrigerator, so he doesn't need to move his. All right, see you later. We're glad you joined us today and hope you learned something valuable about deer management. If you have questions about this podcast or a question about a topic we haven't discussed, please log on to msudeerlab.com, click on the Deer University tab, and send us your questions. We'll get to them as soon as possible. In closing, we want to thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. We also want to thank the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowments that support deer research and education.